Hello friends, how are you feeling tonight? I hope your body is relaxed and your mind is calm. If sleep feels far away, this story might help you drift gently into rest. Tonight, we're traveling back to 17th century New England, into the early days of Plymouth Colony, where brave settlers faced frozen rivers, endless forests, and the challenge of building a new life from scratch. Imagine crossing a vast unknown ocean, arriving in a land that is both beautiful and unforgiving. Picture the first harsh winter, fires crackling in the night, and the quiet struggle of families trying to survive while forging bonds that would last a lifetime. And in the heart of this world, wisdom from the Wampanoag people guided the settlers through every challenge, teaching lessons of patience, courage, and unity. So, get comfortable, take a deep breath, let your eyes close if you like, and let us step together into the quiet world of Plymouth Colony, where every moment holds a story, and every winter whispers secrets of endurance and hope. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another calming history journey. The autumn wind off the English coast carried a bite of salt and rain as the small, square-rigged ship rocked against her mooring lines. It was September of 1620, a season when most sensible captains kept their vessels close to home. Yet the people crowding the quayside of Plymouth Harbour felt an urgency that defied the chill. Mothers clutched thin-faced children swaddled in wool. Men with broad-brimmed hats and worn leather boots tightened the knots on heavy sea chests. Their eyes moved constantly from the darkening sky to the ship's high stern, where the name Mayflower was painted in faded black. William Bradford stood a little apart from the bustle, his cloak snapping against his legs. Only 30 years old, he carried himself with a gravity born of hard experience. Behind his quiet gaze lay memories of secret worship in barns, of hasty midnight flights from the king's officers, of exile among Dutch merchants in Leiden. He thought of his wife Dorothy, pale and silent that morning, and of their young son who remained behind in Holland until the colony could be secured. To leave family was a wound, but Bradford's resolve held. He whispered to himself the words of the psalmist, "They that sow in tears shall reap in joy." The harbour smelled of tar and wet rope. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the clamour of carpenters hammering final repairs. The Mayflower herself was no grand vessel, just over 100 feet from bow to stern, built for the slow trade of wine and wool. Her decks were narrow, her timbers creaked with age, but to these passengers she was a floating covenant, a promise of freedom across 3,000 miles of unknown sea. Captain Christopher Jones barked orders from the quarterdeck. His weathered face betrayed little affection for the separatists he carried, but he knew the Atlantic's moods and watched the sky with a mariner's caution. The equinox gales were near. If they did not depart soon, the ocean would become a wall of black water and icy wind. By dusk, the shoreline blurred into shadow. Lanterns flickered along the wharf as families knelt for prayer. Elder William Brewster raised his voice above the murmur of waves, reciting a blessing that bound them together, that the Lord might make of them a city on a hill, a light to all nations. The words steadied hearts already trembling with fear and anticipation. Below decks, the air was thick with pitch and damp straw. The passengers, more than 100 souls, would spend the next weeks in cramped quarters barely 5 feet high. They stored salted beef, hard biscuit, dried peas, and casks of brackish water. Children peered into the dark corners where rats darted. A young servant named John Howland traced the seams of the planking and wondered if they would hold when the seas grew rough. With the tide, the Mayflower eased away from the quay. Ropes slipped free. The sails bellied in the rising wind. The shoreline of England faded into a smear of grey, and the night swallowed the ship. Many wept softly, though the sound of the surf soon drowned their voices. For some, it was the ache of leaving homeland and kin. For others, it was the vast uncertainty ahead. The Atlantic stretched before them like an endless wilderness. Days merged into nights measured only by the creak of timbers and the slow arc of the sun. Storms came early. Black clouds piled high, and waves slammed the hull with a force that shuddered through every beam. Water leaked through the seams, soaking bedding and provisions. Children cried with cold, while men bailed ceaselessly. In one violent squall, the main beam cracked with a sound like cannon fire. Panic spread until a passenger produced a massive iron screw, brought for house building, that braced the beam and saved the voyage. Bradford kept a journal by the light of a guttering lantern. He wrote of the many fierce storms with which we were tossed, but also of moments when the sea lay calm as glass, when the stars spread like a jeweled cloak across the heavens. On such nights, he felt the hand of Providence guiding their fragile craft. He thought of the new world waiting, a land of dense forests and wide rivers, where, so rumor said, the air was sharp and clean and the earth rich for planting. Weeks passed. Scurvy gnawed at gums. Fever took the weak. A child was born amid the tossing of the waves and named Oceanus. Others were not so fortunate. Burials at sea were brief and brutal. A prayer, a weighted shroud, a splash lost to the endless deep. At last, after 66 days, a cry rang from the masthead. "Land! Land ho!" Pale against the November dawn lay a ragged coast, sand dunes and dark pine ridges dusted with early snow. It was not the fertile Hudson River valley of their charter, but a harsher northern shore, Cape Cod. Yet the weary passengers knelt in thanks. To them, it was the goodly land of Scripture, a place where they might worship in peace. Bradford watched the strange coastline draw nearer. His heart swelled with mingled awe and trepidation. The wilderness waited, vast and unyielding, but so too did the promise of a life shaped by faith and freedom. As the Mayflower anchored in the cold harbor, he whispered a final line to his journal. Being thus arrived in a good harbor and brought safe to land, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven. The wind off the Atlantic smelled of pine and frost. Beyond the dunes, an unseen continent lay silent, holding the trials, alliances and sorrows that would define the first years of Plymouth Colony, and, in time, the very soul of New England. The November sun rose weak and thin, a pale disk behind veils of mist as the Mayflower rocked in the grey waters of Cape Cod Bay. Cold air knifed across the deck, carrying the resinous scent of pine and the faint cries of unseen birds. For the passengers, the sight of land after 2 months at sea brought a surge of relief, but also the heavy realization that their trial had only begun. The shoreline curved in long, low dunes tufted with coarse grass and stunted oaks. Inland, dark forests stood like walls, their branches etched with rime. Bradford studied the landscape and felt both wonder and dread. No fields cleared, no houses smoking in welcome, only an immense silence broken by the slap of waves and the distant rush of wind through trees. Captain Jones anchored in the natural harbour, unwilling to risk the dangerous shoals farther south. The passengers crowded the rail, faces chapped and hollow-eyed. Some whispered prayers of gratitude, others clutched their coats tighter, aware of the biting air that seeped through every seam. Before any step ashore, they faced a crucial task. Their original patent under the Virginia Company was useless here, far north of its authority. Disorder threatened. So, in the cramped cabin, the men drafted a simple covenant, a combination they called it, binding themselves to form a civil body politic, to enact just and equal laws for the good of the colony. Each man signed in turn, quill scratching across parchment. John Carver, William Bradford, Edward Winslow, Miles Standish, and others whose names would echo through the generations. This Mayflower Compact, as it would later be known, was less grand in the moment than necessity demanded, yet it marked the birth of self-government in their new world. On a clear morning, a small party set out to explore the coast. They rowed the shallop through icy swells, landing on a narrow beach littered with shells and driftwood. The sand squeaked underfoot, the cold so sharp it numbed their legs through woolen stockings. They found springs of fresh water bubbling among the dunes and, most startling, signs of habitation. Carefully buried baskets of corn, dried and golden, hidden beneath layers of sand. Respecting survival over strict propriety, they took some, pledging to repay the unknown owners when met. As days passed, more expeditions probed the coastline. Snow fell in fine, wind-driven sheets. The forest loomed dark and watchful, filled with the creak of frozen branches and the sudden, startling calls of unseen creatures. At night, the men huddled by driftwood fires, muskets close at hand, for they knew little of the native people whose corn they had borrowed. Tracks in the snow told of silent eyes following their movements. Illness spread aboard the anchored ship. The damp, unventilated 'tween decks reeked of sickness. Fever burned in children's cheeks. Coughs echoed in the darkness. Bradford's own wife, Dorothy, fell quiet and distant, standing often at the rail to stare across the grey water. One bitter afternoon, while he explored the shore with the landing party, she slipped, or perhaps stepped, over the side and drowned in the frigid harbour. When Bradford returned, numb from the cold and from grief, he wrote only a single spare line in his journal, unable to give shape to the wound. Despite tragedy, the work of settlement pressed forward. They chose a site across the bay where a brook of fresh water met a gentle hill, the land offering some shelter from winter gales. Axes rang through the frosty air as men felled trees, the scent of sap and pine heavy around them. Women and children still slept aboard the ship, while rough houses rose slowly from the frozen ground. Timber walls were chinked with clay, roofs thatched with reeds. Each evening, smoke from the first crude chimneys drifted like a blessing into the darkening sky. Relations with the native people remained a silent tension until early March, when the snow began to retreat. One day, a tall man strode boldly into the half-built settlement, unarmed and smiling. "Welcome, Englishmen," he said in clear, accented words that startled the colonists into stillness. His name was Samoset, a sagamore of the Wabanaki, who had learned English from fishermen along the coast of Maine. Through him, they soon met Tisquantum, Squanto, of the Patuxet, who had crossed the ocean twice and returned with hard-won knowledge of both worlds. Squanto became their indispensable guide. He showed them how to plant corn in mounds with fish as fertilizer, how to tap maple trees for sap, how to find eels in the muddy flats at night. More crucially, he brokered a treaty with Massasoit, sachem of the Wampanoag Confederacy, ensuring a fragile peace. Bradford, now elected governor after the sudden death of John Carver, recognized providence in this alliance. Without it, the colony might have perished within the year. Spring softened the land. Forests flushed with tender green. Rivers ran high with meltwater. The settlers sowed corn, barley, and peas in the newly turned earth. Still, the scars of winter lingered. Of the more than 100 who had crossed the Atlantic, barely half survived that first cruel season. Graves dotted the hillside beyond the palisade, each marked with plain wooden stakes to disguise their number from any hostile eyes. Yet as the sun climbed higher and days grew long, hope returned. Children chased each other among the budding oaks. The smell of baking bread drifted from hearths. In the evenings, voices rose in psalms that carried across the quiet bay. Bradford wrote of a sense of comfort and refreshment, though he never forgot the cold that had claimed so many lives. When autumn came again, the fields yielded a harvest beyond expectation: golden corn, fat pumpkins, beans twining high on poles. To give thanks, the colonists invited Massasoit and his people to a feast that lasted 3 days. Venison roasted over open fires, wild fowl sizzled on spits, and the air was sweet with the smoke of cedar and pine. English hymns mingled with the rhythmic chants of the Wampanoag. Two worlds briefly joined in celebration. As night settled over the clearing, stars glittered above the dark forest, bright and uncountable. Bradford looked upward and felt a quiet awe. The journey had cost them dearly, yet here they stood, a fragile community surviving against odds as immense as the sky. In the hush between songs, he thought of those still in England, of the unmarked graves along the hill, of the covenant that bound them all. He wrote later that they were stepping stones for those who should come after, unaware that their small settlement would one day be remembered as the birthplace of a nation. The moon climbed higher above the salt-bitten pines. laying a silver sheen across the worn rooftops of the settlement. And the night stillness deepened like a tide slowly drawing breath. Within the parsonage, a candle burned low, its thin flame bending to every sigh of air, and Reverend Samuel Drake at last set down his quill. He had written, until the cramped letters blurred, a careful record of the day's events, sermons delivered, disputes settled, births and deaths noted with equal gravity. Yet even as the ink dried, he felt the weight of the wilderness pressing in, a presence just beyond the timber walls, as though the vast dark forest kept its own watch over the fragile human lights. Down the lane, Mary Whitfield moved quietly about her kitchen, the day's bread cooling on the hearthstone. Her husband and eldest son had not yet returned from the fishing grounds, and though she told herself the tide simply ran slow, a hush lingered in her chest. She listened to the faint cry of a nightbird and the distant creak of the dock, sounds that might have been comfort or warning. When the latch finally lifted, she exhaled. Yet the figures who entered brought more than the scent of the sea. They carried rumors. A distant neighbor had vanished, last seen before dusk when he went to cut firewood. No trail, no cry, only the echo of his axe striking once and then no more. By morning, the village gathered in the meeting house, rough benches filled with men in weather-worn coats and women with shawls drawn tight. Reverend Drake read a psalm in measured tones while his eyes searched every face. Among the listeners was young Nathaniel Briggs, barely 15, who remembered the missing man's stories of old Wampanoag legends, spirits in the marsh, voices that whispered before storms. Now Nathaniel wondered whether such tales held a kernel of truth, and whether the forest that ringed their clearing kept more than deer and shadow. The elders organized a search. They set out with muskets and lanterns, their boots sinking in mossy ground as mist curled between the trunks. Hours passed. They found the fallen tree, the half-split log, and the lone axe embedded in its grain, but no sign of the woodcutter, only the hush of leaves overhead, broken by the sudden call of a distant owl. Some crossed themselves. Others muttered that perhaps the man had simply wandered too far and lost his way. Yet the trail ended abruptly, as if the earth had swallowed him whole. Back in the settlement, Mary Whitfield offered broth to those who returned, her hands steady though her thoughts raced. Children clung to their mothers, sensing unease that no comforting words could soften. Reverend Drake closed the meeting house with a final prayer. Yet he lingered on the threshold long after the congregation drifted away, eyes fixed on the dark line of trees where the night seemed to breathe. And so the days moved forward, each dawn edged with the knowledge that something, or someone, was missing. The colony continued its careful rhythms, smoke from chimneys, nets cast into the cold Atlantic, psalms rising on the Sabbath. But beneath the routine pulsed a quiet vigilance. Every creak of the woods, every flicker of light along the marsh, set hearts quickening. The settlers had crossed an ocean for freedom and faith, yet here in this new world, they learned that even in the hard-won clearing, mystery walked beside them, patient and unyielding, like the endless forest itself. Dawn arrived wrapped in a hush so complete that even the gulls held their cries. A thin frost silvered the marsh grass and caught in the seams of the split-rail fences. From the meeting house steeple, the small bell gave a single measured toll to call the faithful, and its note drifted across the settlement like a breath held too long. Reverend Samuel Drake stood beneath that bell's echo, his cloak drawn tight, and felt the weight of another day's unanswered questions. The search for the missing woodcutter had stretched into a third morning. Men who once strode confidently into the wild now hesitated at the tree line, as though the forest itself had grown taller overnight. They spoke little. Muskets were cleaned and reloaded, not in preparation for war, but as a quiet ritual, a shield against the unknown. Mary Whitfield rose before the sun, kneading bread with deliberate care. Each turn of the dough steadied her thoughts. She had dreamed of the absent man, saw him standing among black-barked pines, eyes lifted to a sky without stars. When she woke, the image clung to her like wood smoke. She said nothing to her husband, only pressed the heel of her palm into the dough until it warmed beneath her touch. Young Nathaniel Briggs waited at the edge of the wharf, watching the tide slide in pale ribbons beneath the ice. He carried the memory of the search in every muscle, the sudden silences in the woods, the scent of cold earth where no footprints remained. He traced the haft of his own small axe and wondered if the missing man had felt some call deeper than hunger or fear, a pull from the very marrow of the land. By late morning, a heavy sky gathered over Salem's clearing. Clouds moved low, their undersides bruised with violet. The elders met once more in the meeting house, candlelight flickering against the timber beams. Reverend Drake read from the Psalms, his voice steady though his mind strayed to the unspoken. If the forest could swallow a man without trace, what might it take next? A decision formed like slow ice. Another search would begin at dusk, when the tide turned and the moon rose. Lanterns were trimmed, ropes coiled, and a prayer offered not only for the lost, but for those who would go looking. Women packed small bundles of bread and dried fish, slipping them into the hunters' satchels without words. Children clung to skirts and coats, wide-eyed at the gravity in their parents' faces. When evening came, the men moved out in a single file, lanterns casting soft halos against the rising mist. Mary watched from her doorway, a shawl about her shoulders, the smell of baking bread still on her hands. Nathaniel followed at the rear, determination and unease warring in his young heart. Behind them, the settlement lay like a handful of embers in a sea of dark. Ahead stretched the boundless woodland, each tree a pillar of shadow, each breath of wind a whisper of something unseen. The forest received them without protest. Snow began to fall in delicate flakes that glimmered against the lantern glow. Branches arched overhead, weaving the night into a vaulted chamber. Step by step, the colonies chosen crossed from the known into the realm of possibility, where old stories waited like roots beneath the frozen ground, and the silence carried more than sound. It carried the slow, patient presence of a world far older than their own. The snow deepened as the searchers pressed farther beneath the canopy, each footfall a soft sigh against the forest floor. Lantern light wavered across trunks thick with lichen and frost, their pale bark reflecting like distant moons. Reverend Drake led the way, his breath clouding in the cold, his thoughts a quiet litany of scripture and unspoken dread. Behind him, Nathaniel Briggs kept pace, the weight of the small axe at his side both comfort and burden. He watched the shadows stretch and bend with the flicker of the lanterns, saw shapes that might have been branches, or might have been something more, and felt the slow tightening of wonder and fear. Mary Whitfield had not stayed behind. Against her husband's pleading, she had followed, carrying a lantern of her own. She moved with measured steps, the bread she had baked still cooling back at the house, its scent now only a memory in the cold. Her dream of the missing woodcutter lingered in her thoughts, a silent guide she could neither trust nor ignore. The party reached the frozen brook where hunters once came for deer. Ice lay thick over dark water, a glassy mirror catching the faint light of the moon. Here the Reverend called a halt, his voice a low murmur against the sighing wind. They listened. Only the creek's slow current spoke, a muted gurgle beneath its icy skin. One of the older men, Elias Hart, stooped to examine a scattering of pine needles half buried in snow. He lifted a broken twig, freshly snapped, the green wood bright against the dark. A sign, or the forest's own careless gesture. None could tell. Yet hope kindled briefly in their eyes, a spark that cut the chill. They moved on, deeper still. The trees crowded closer, their black branches knitting overhead like the beams of some ancient cathedral. The air smelled of resin and distant salt from the unseen sea. Somewhere far off, a lone owl called, the sound rising and falling like a question without answer. Hours passed in a slow procession of silence and soft snow. The lanterns burned lower, oil thinning, yet no man spoke of turning back. Even as the cold gnawed through wool and leather, a stubborn purpose bound them, to find the one who was lost, or to prove that the world had not simply swallowed him whole. Mary felt the dream again, a pull just beyond sight. She quickened her pace until she walked beside the Reverend. He glanced at her, but did not speak. Together, they followed a barely visible path where the snow lay disturbed, leading toward a stand of ancient pines. There, beneath the tallest tree, they found a clearing awash in moonlight. The snow was smooth, unbroken, save for a single set of prints that ended abruptly in the center, as though the earth itself had risen to erase their maker. Lanterns lifted high, the searchers circled the spot. No body, no struggle. Only the soft hush of falling snow and the steady, patient watch of the trees. Nathaniel shivered, not from cold, but from the sense that they had stepped into a story older than any sermon. Reverend Drake knelt, pressing a gloved hand to the final footprint. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer that seemed to vanish before it reached the air. Around him, the forest listened, vast and unmoved, while above the moon sailed on, pale and indifferent, casting its cold blessing over the mystery that deepened with every breath. The searchers lingered in the moon-washed clearing, their breaths rising like frail smoke into the winter night. No one spoke for a long while. The hush pressed against them with a weight as real as stone, and even the owls had stilled their calls. Reverend Drake traced the edge of the last footprint once more, his gloved finger sinking slightly into the crust of snow. It was a man's print, clear and strong, and then nothing, as if the world beyond that single step had folded inward. Elias Hart broke the silence first. Could be he turned back, he said, though the words faltered even as they left his mouth. All eyes followed the unbroken whiteness stretching behind them. There were no returning tracks. Nathaniel Briggs felt the hair along his neck prickle. He thought of the old Algonquian stories whispered by traders, spirits that walked only in moonlight, forests that could swallow a soul whole if it strayed too far from fire and prayer. He tightened his grip on the axe, its worn handle warm against his palm. Mary Whitfield stepped forward, lantern held high. Her dream hovered close, black pines, a man without a shadow. She knelt beside the Reverend, the lantern's glow soft against her pale face. "He is near," she said quietly, though she could not have said why she knew it. The Reverend lifted his gaze to the ring of ancient trees. "We go on," he decided, voice low but firm. "If the Lord leads, we follow." They moved beyond the clearing, deeper into the forest where the snow grew heavy and the path uncertain. Branches hung low with ice, catching moonlight like shards of glass. Every sound, the crunch of boots, the hiss of lantern wicks, seemed magnified, each echo folding back on itself until it was impossible to tell whether the noise came from them or from something moving just beyond sight. Hours stretched thin. Frost crept into beards and lashes, and still they pressed forward. At last, the trees opened onto a narrow hollow where the ground sloped toward a frozen pond. The ice reflected the moon in a perfect disk, an unbroken mirror. There, at the far edge, stood a figure. He was motionless, back turned, cloak pale beneath the moonlight. For an instant, none dared breathe. Then Reverend Drake called out, "Samuel Cutter, is that you?" The name rang across the pond, clear and bright. The figure did not move. Nathaniel stepped closer, the ice groaning underfoot. "Sir," he said, his young voice trembling, "we have searched for you." Slowly the figure turned. A face came into view, familiar yet changed, eyes reflecting the moon with an uncanny light. It was indeed the woodcutter, though his expression held no recognition. His lips parted as if to speak, but only a thin wisp of breath escaped. Mary's lantern flickered wildly. The air grew sharp, charged like the moment before a storm. The woodcutter raised one hand, palm outward, a gesture of both warning and plea. Then, without sound, he stepped backward, and the surface of the pond swallowed him like mist. A cry broke from the party. Nathaniel lunged forward, but the Reverend seized his arm. Beneath them, the ice lay undisturbed, a flawless sheet of silver. No ripple, no crack, no sign that anyone had ever stood there. The searchers stood rooted, hearts hammering. Around them the forest closed again, its branches knitting tighter, as if to guard a secret far older than the colony itself. Above, the moon slid behind a veil of cloud, and darkness reclaimed the hollow, leaving only the faint gleam of their lanterns and the echo of a mystery that would follow them back to Salem for the rest of their days. The return to the settlement was hushed, each footfall on the snow-laden path weighed with disbelief and a quiet dread. Lanterns swung gently in the hands of the searchers, casting long, trembling shadows that danced across the frozen earth. Reverend Drake walked at the head, his eyes fixed straight ahead, though in truth he saw little of the forest around him. In his mind, the image of the pond, flawless and unbroken, haunted every step. The woodcutter's pale figure, the silent retreat into the moonlit ice, and the impossibility of what they had witnessed. Nathaniel Briggs kept close to Mary Whitfield, whose hands were steady though her face remained pale. "Did he disappear?" she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Nathaniel could only shake his head. Words seemed fragile in the presence of a mystery that had touched them all. The wind rustled through the pines, carrying with it the faint scent of resin and something darker, indefinable. A reminder that the forest kept its own counsel. When the settlement came into view, the first smoke from hearths rose against the star-specked sky, and the lights of simple wooden homes glimmered like faint beacons. The villagers had gathered, drawn by the lingering sounds of the search party, their faces etched with worry. Relief was tempered by a shared unease, as whispers spread of the pond and its uncanny silence. Mothers clutched children, men crossed themselves, and the elders exchanged solemn looks. Reverend Drake addressed the assembly quietly, choosing each word with care. "We have searched, and yet some things remain beyond our understanding," he said. "Let this night remind us that the wilderness is vast, and providence guides us in ways unseen. We return, strengthened by our courage, yet humbled before the mysteries of this new land." That night, the village settled under a blanket of frost and wind. Fires burned low in chimneys, and the soft glow of candles lit windows that shivered against the cold. Inside their modest homes, families whispered prayers, recounted stories of the day, and tried to soothe minds unsettled by the impossible. Nathaniel lay awake beside the hearth, the lantern's glow casting shadows on the walls. He thought of the woodcutter, of the forest's silent judgment, and of the fragile line between life and the mysteries that live just beyond human comprehension. Bradford, in his cabin, wrote in the margins of his journal by candlelight. He recorded facts of the day, the search, the missing man, the signs of the forest, but also the awe that lingered in his spirit. He wrote of providence, of faith tested not only by wind and frost, but by enigmas the world might never explain. He reflected on the delicate balance of survival, of community, and of the bond that held the colony together against the vast and often unforgiving wilderness. Outside, the moon drifted behind clouds, silver light spilling intermittently across the frozen clearing. The forest watched in silence. Somewhere, beyond the reach of lanterns and human understanding, life and mystery coexisted, patient and eternal. And in the quiet heart of Salem, the settlers slept, dreaming in fragile comfort, unaware that the events of this night would echo in memory, in story, and in the whispered caution of generations yet to come. Morning came slow, muted under a grey sky. Snowflakes fell softly, settling on rooftops, fence posts, and the frozen pond, whose surface remained undisturbed. Life in the colony continued with careful rhythm, yet an unspoken reverence hung in the air. Every shadow in the woods, every distant sound, was now marked by the memory of the night the forest had claimed, or perhaps simply reminded them of its vast, inscrutable will. Reverend Drake, walking among the villagers as they tended hearths and fields, felt the silent weight of responsibility. He reminded them gently to to give thanks for their survival, to pray for the lost, and to act always with faith and humility. The young and old alike, though uneasy, followed his words, comforted in the structure of routine and the presence of community, even as a quiet wonder lingered in their hearts. And so, the settlement endured. Frost gave way to spring's slow thaw, the forest whispered with renewed life, and the memory of the vanished woodcutter became part of the colony's shared story, a reminder that the new world, though promising, was a place of both grace and mystery, where courage, faith, and vigilance were as necessary as the food they planted and the fires they tended. Spring crept cautiously into the settlement. Pale sunlight fell across frost-darkened fields, illuminating the rough timber of the first homes and the scattered heaps of stones marking graves. Snow lingered in the shadows, and every stream ran swollen with the meltwater of ice, carrying the bitter scent of winter's retreat. The settlers, hardened by months of deprivation, moved with careful diligence. Tools scraped earth from furrows, hammers rang against frame walls, and the steady rhythm of labor brought a fragile sense of normalcy. Yet beneath it all lingered the memory of the pond, of the vanished woodcutter, and of the forest's watchful silence. William Bradford walked along the edge of the brook that cut through the settlement, his boots sinking into the muddy bank. He traced the current with his eyes, noting how it curved and split around islands of reeds and fallen branches. Here, he thought, the forest had offered both sustenance and peril. Its waters would provide fish, its banks fertile soil, but also, he knew, hidden dangers, swift currents, and treacherous ice in winter. Nearby, Nathaniel Briggs tested a line of cord across the stream. He was learning the ways of the water under Squanto's careful guidance, how to set traps for eels, how to read the subtle currents, how to respect the river as both provider and judge. Squanto's presence was a quiet marvel to all. He spoke little of himself, yet every motion carried authority, every gesture precise. Through him, the settlers began to glimpse the depth of knowledge the Wampanoag had carried across generations, a symbiosis with the land that was foreign and humbling. One morning, Bradford joined a small party led by Edward Winslow to examine the river's wider course. They hoped to find a suitable site for new planting and to understand the floodplain's patterns. The air was sharp, carrying the faint tang of pine and mud. Birdsong flickered between the bare branches. For a moment, Bradford allowed himself to forget the winter's loss, to see only the promise of life returning. As they followed the river upstream, the men discovered a series of shallow rapids. Water tumbled over smooth stones, white with foam. Winslow knelt, dipping a hand into the current. Strong, he observed, and relentless. This stream will teach patience to any who rely upon it. Bradford nodded, feeling a strange kinship with the river, persistent, unyielding, yet sustaining all who approached with respect. By mid-afternoon, they reached a bend where the current widened into a still pool. Here, the reflections of leafless oaks danced across the water, fractured by the gentle ripple of trout beneath the surface. Bradford watched for long minutes, noting how the pool's edges were rich with soil, perfect for planting. The river, he thought, was a living testament to providence, a mixture of danger and opportunity, of beauty and necessity. Squanto arrived at that moment, stepping lightly from the opposite bank. "Here," he said, pointing to a patch of soil beneath the older trees. "Corn will grow well if fish are buried beneath each hill, and if storms come, water will flow around the planting, not drown it." His words were precise, economical, yet every syllable carried authority. The settlers listened, absorbing each lesson with awe and careful attention. Bradford sank to his knees beside him. He pressed fingers into the dark soil, feeling its warmth and moisture. "You have taught us more than any book could," he murmured. Squanto's face remained calm, unreadable, but there was a flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the party made its way back to the settlement, carrying knowledge in their minds and hope in their hearts. The river had become a teacher as formidable as any winter gale or forest shadow. It reminded them that survival in this new world required observation, patience, and respect for both the land and those who had walked it before. That night, as fires burned low in chimneys and lanterns flickered in windows, Bradford wrote once more in his journal. He described the river's course, the patterns of its currents, the richness of its banks. He wrote of Squanto's wisdom and of the quiet endurance of the settlers. And though he recorded each detail with meticulous care, he allowed himself a rare moment of wonder. The sense that the new world was vast, mysterious, and alive, and that their small settlement, precarious as it was, had found a foothold along its flowing heart. Above the village, stars glittered cold and constant. The river whispered in the night, carrying with it the lessons of patience, the promise of life, and the ever-present reminder that the wilderness, though indifferent, offered sustenance to those who approached with humility and courage. Spring deepened into early summer, and the settlement at Plymouth hummed with cautious vitality. Timber-framed homes, their roofs newly thatched, rose in clusters along the cleared fields, smoke curling like silver threads into the pale sky. The settlers moved with purpose, voices muted but steady, each step and gesture part of the delicate choreography required to survive in a land both generous and unforgiving. Bradford walked among the fields with William Brewster, noting the first shoots of corn rising in neat mounds along the river's edge. The soil was dark, loamy, and alive with the promise of growth. Each plant carried the weight of hope, each furrowed row a testament to labor and careful instruction from Squanto. Bradford bent to press a finger into the earth, feeling warmth beneath the cool surface. The colony's survival depended not only on courage, but on understanding, patience, and the wisdom that had been offered from the very people who had once owned this land. Children chased one another along the narrow paths between houses, their laughter light, echoing against the dense trees that hemmed in the clearing. Nathaniel Briggs helped his younger brother balance a small bucket, filled with water drawn from the brook. The memory of winter's losses, the frozen pond, the vanished woodcutter still clung, but now there was also a fragile joy, a sense that life could persist even in a land so vast and strange. Yet beneath the rhythm of labor and the first sweetness of harvest, shadows lingered. Reports came from the outskirts. Hunters found places where snow had once revealed odd tracks, deep impressions in mud that ended abruptly, as if swallowed by the forest itself. Elders murmured warnings, and the settlers, though resolute, learned to tread with awareness. The wilderness had its own rules. The colony's survival depended on respect as much as bravery. One evening, Bradford convened a council in the meeting house. The lanterns cast a soft glow on worn faces, and the smell of beeswax and pine hung in the air. Discussions turned to the river, the planting season, and the patrols for game. Then, quietly, he asked for observations on the strange happenings near the forest edge. Silence followed. Finally, a hunter named Thomas Prince spoke. "I saw prints in the mud," he said. "Big, longer than any man. They vanished at the creek, just ended, no path beyond." The words rippled through the assembly. Some exchanged uneasy glances, others lowered heads in quiet prayer. Bradford nodded, choosing carefully. "We cannot ignore the signs of the land, yet we must also trust in the Lord, in providence, and in the strength He has given us. Let vigilance guide us, but let fear not rule our hearts." That night, as the settlement settled under a pale moon, Bradford walked alone to the riverbank. Water whispered over stones, carrying the scent of mud and pine. He remembered the vanished woodcutter and the silent pond. He thought of Squanto and the knowledge he shared, of the fragile alliance with Massasoit, and of the delicate web of survival they were weaving. Above him, stars pierced the sky like cold diamonds. The forest loomed, dark and eternal, and the river reflected the constellations in its quiet flow. Bradford knelt, pressing both hands to the wet soil, feeling its pulse, sensing its hidden life. He whispered a prayer, not only for guidance and protection, but for understanding, that the colony might grow, learn, and endure without arrogance. In the days that followed, work continued. Corn rose taller, beans twined around poles, and the settlers learned the subtle language of the land: where to plant, how to fish, when to watch. Evenings were filled with psalms and hymns, their voices carrying across the clearing into the forested night. Children slept, dreaming of growing crops, of laughter, of the hope that threaded each day despite loss and mystery. And always, the shadows remained. The forest watched, patient and eternal. The river whispered its lessons in every eddy and ripple. The settlers, small and fragile against the vastness, moved with careful respect, balancing courage and humility. In this tension, life persisted, and Bradford, standing amid the green of early summer, understood that survival in the new world was as much about reverence and wisdom as it was about toil and faith. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 7? Alliances and Trials, where the settlers' relationship with the Wampanoag deepens, revealing both cooperation and tension, and the colony faces its first major political and social tests. The warmth of early summer settled over the settlement like a gentle promise, yet beneath it lay a web of delicate negotiations, unspoken fears, and the ever-present weight of survival. Bradford rose before dawn, stepping lightly across the dew-slicked path to the meeting house where the colony's council gathered. William Brewster, Edward Winslow, and Miles Standish waited, each face etched with concern and thought. Today's business extended beyond planting, hunting, or repairs. It was about alliances, obligations, and the fragile peace with the Wampanoag that had allowed the colony to endure. Squanto arrived first, moving with the quiet assurance of one who belonged equally to both worlds. His dark eyes scanned the council, noting each expression, each hesitation. Massasoit's emissaries were expected, and the settlers felt the tension of unspoken questions. Could trust, forged through necessity, hold in the face of cultural divide, scarcity, and fear? By mid-morning, Massasoit himself appeared on the hill above the clearing, accompanied by warriors in soft leather garments, their faces painted with ochre and charcoal in subtle patterns of clan and rank. The air was electric with anticipation. Children peeked from behind posts, women clutched shawls, and even the hardened men of the colony straightened with a mixture of respect and wariness. Bradford stepped forward, bowing slightly, a gesture of both diplomacy and humility. "Great Sachem Massasoit," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "We welcome you to our clearing. Your friendship has preserved lives, and your counsel has guided our planting. May this meeting honor both our people and the Lord." Massasoit inclined his head, his expression unreadable. "You have endured the winter," he said in measured English, his voice deep, carrying both authority and curiosity. "You respect the land and the river. You listen. That is a beginning. But the world beyond your clearing is not without its shadows. Peace is tested. Promises are made, yet must be kept." Edward Winslow translated Squanto's words for the council, each syllable carrying weight. The settlers listened, recognizing that the forest and its unseen powers, the river and its currents, and the alliances they forged were equally vital. Life in the New World demanded diplomacy as much as labor, patience as much as courage. Over the following weeks, the colony and the Wampanoag engaged in careful collaboration. Native warriors assisted in the planting of corn, teaching methods refined over generations. Fish buried at the base of hills, spacing to encourage healthy growth, and the timing of planting according to moon and rain. In return, the settlers offered goods of cloth, metal tools, and small trinkets, symbols of goodwill that bridged the gap between two worlds. Yet not all was tranquil. Misunderstandings arose, sometimes over a misplaced tool, sometimes over a crop or a hunting ground. Miles Standish, ever vigilant, had to balance diplomacy with defense, ensuring that a gesture of caution did not become a provocation. One evening, a hunting party returning from the forest found that several traps had been removed or destroyed. The settlers feared theft. Massasoit's people insisted it was a misunderstanding, that the traps interfered with migration routes of deer important to the Wampanoag. Tempers flared, words were exchanged, and it fell to Bradford and Squanto to mediate. Bradford convened the council beneath the wide limbs of a great oak. "We are guests on this land," he reminded the settlers, his gaze steady. "We cannot dictate its ways, yet we are bound to each other through covenant and necessity. Patience, respect, and clarity must guide our actions." Squanto's voice, calm and precise, carried the same lesson to both sides. The river does not judge the stones it carries, it flows around them. So must you find ways around anger, fear, and misunderstanding. By summer's end, the harmony of labor and ritual settled over the clearing once more. Corn grew tall, beans twined around poles, and children played among the rows, learning both English and Wampanoag words. Fires burned in evening kitchens, filling the air with the aroma of bread and roasting fowl, while across the river, Massasoit's people sang songs of harvest, their voices mingling with the settlers' hymns in a soft, imperfect harmony. Bradford, standing on the small hill overlooking the clearing, felt a quiet awe. The colony had survived not only winter's merciless bite, but the ever-present unknown of the wilderness, the delicate politics of alliance, and the shadow of fear that had walked with them like a silent companion. Life in this new world was a constant negotiation with both the land and those who had lived upon it long before the English crossed the ocean. As dusk fell, the forest exhaled in the whisper of leaves, the river hummed its eternal song, and Bradford made his way to the meeting house to record the day's events. He wrote not only of planting and harvest, but of diplomacy, trust, and the lessons etched into the colony's memory by both Providence and the Wampanoag. He understood that the future would demand courage, wisdom, and humility in equal measure, and that the survival of Plymouth depended as much on hearts and minds as on hands and axes. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 8? Winter returns, where the colony faces its first true test of endurance after months of labor, and hidden tensions among the settlers and the wilderness emerge once more. The promise of summer's warmth slowly waned as autumn whispered across the settlement. Leaves, once green and vibrant, turned amber and crimson, fluttering to the ground in soft, rustling cascades. The air sharpened with the first hints of frost, carrying the scent of damp earth, drying corn husks, and smoke from chimneys. Bradford walked through the fields, noting the progress of the harvest, the thickening stores of corn and beans carefully stacked in granaries. Yet beneath the apparent abundance lay a subtle unease. Winter would return, and with it the trials that had nearly undone them before. Children ran along the narrow paths between cabins, their laughter bright but fleeting, as if each step carried a warning. Nathaniel Briggs lingered by the edge of the river, eyes tracing its slow, inevitable current. He thought of the vanished woodcutter, the pond's silent depths, and the lessons the forest had offered, the patience to observe, the humility to learn, and the courage to endure. These lessons seemed more pressing now, as the horizon grew heavy with grey clouds, hinting at snow yet to come. Reverend Drake convened a meeting in the evening. The council gathered beneath the lantern-lit rafters of the meeting house. The settlers, their faces weary from months of labor, listened closely as he spoke. "Providence has granted us bounty," he said, "yet we must not grow complacent. Winter's grip will test our fortitude once more. We must prepare. Firewood stacked, granaries filled, and watch kept over both the land and one another." Miles Standish, ever vigilant, reported patrols along the forest edge. He spoke of strange sounds carried on the wind, the echo of footsteps that could belong to man or beast, and the unsettling stillness where life should have thrived. Bradford listened, his brow furrowed, knowing that caution now meant survival later. One morning, a hunting party returned with troubling news. The deer had begun to move deeper into the forest, beyond reach, and the frozen pond of winter past had shifted strangely. Ice had formed in uneven layers, black beneath the white crust, as though the water itself resisted the touch of frost. Nathaniel, who had accompanied the hunters, described the hollow echoes of the trees, the way the wind seemed to whisper through branches like voices. Even the most hardened men paused, uncertain whether the forest watched or waited. Mary Whitfield moved among the settlers with quiet resolve, tending the children and assisting the elders in preserving the harvest. She carried the memory of the vanished woodcutter in her chest, an ache softened by prayer and labor. Each loaf of bread she baked, each bundle of beans she packed, was an offering to sustain life in a place where survival was never guaranteed. As the first heavy snow fell, the settlement drew inward. Roofs creaked under its weight, smoke from hearths spiraled straight into the sky, and the forest beyond became a wall of white, its depths secretive and silent. Bradford watched from a small hill, his journal open despite numb fingers, recording each detail. The patterns of snowfall, the depth of drifts, the behavior of animals, and the whispers of the wind. He knew that history itself was being written here, not in distant halls of power, but in the careful observation, courage, and endurance of this fragile outpost. One evening, Nathaniel returned to the meeting house after fetching firewood, his eyes wide. "Father Bradford," he said, voice tight with awe. "There are tracks in the snow, footprints, large, unlike any man. They end at the forest's edge, and nothing continues beyond." Bradford felt a shiver that had little to do with the cold. He followed Nathaniel outside, lanterns casting trembling light over the fresh snow. The tracks were unmistakable, long, deliberate, and abruptly vanishing where the forest began. Memories of the pond, the vanished woodcutter, and the silent forest pressed against him like a tide. The settlers gathered, tense, yet calm under Bradford's steady presence. They did not speak of fear, only of preparation. Firewood stacked higher, watchful eyes on the edge of the clearing, prayers offered quietly each night. The wilderness remained vast, patient, and indifferent, and yet the settlers endured, understanding that survival depended as much on vigilance and unity as on faith and labor. As the wind howled through the forest, the snow thickened, and the settlement huddled within its fragile walls. Bradford lifted his eyes to the horizon. He saw not only the challenge of the coming winter, but also the resilience that had brought them this far. The colony had survived storms, hunger, and the mysteries of the land. And though shadows lingered at the forest's edge, life persisted, delicate, tentative, and yet unwavering in its pursuit of light, warmth, and continuity. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 9? The Long Night, where winter's severity brings both danger and revelation, testing the settlers' unity, faith, and courage against nature and the lingering mysteries of the forest. Winter settled over the settlement with relentless quiet. Snow fell in thick, persistent sheets, draping roofs and fields alike in a blanket of white so uniform that the boundaries between earth, river, and sky blurred. The wind carried a biting chill, cutting through woolen garments and leather boots, whispering through the trees in long, hollow sighs. Bradford watched from his small hill, noting how the settlement seemed to shrink under the weight of frost. The cabins clustered close, their fires burning low but steady. Inside the meeting house, the council gathered by lantern light, shadows flickering across walls darkened with smoke and age. William Brewster and Edward Winslow spoke of provisions, calculating how long the stored corn, beans, and salted meats might last if the snow persisted. Miles Standish reported patrols and hunting expeditions, curtailed by drifts too deep to traverse safely. Each word carried weight. Every decision could tip the balance between survival and calamity. Nathaniel Briggs worked alongside Mary Whitfield and other villagers to reinforce roofs and ensure that granaries were secured against the weight of snow. The memory of the vanished woodcutter and the pond where he had disappeared lingered unspoken among them, a quiet reminder that the forest held powers beyond comprehension. Children, bundled in furs, peeked out windows, their laughter subdued, their curiosity tempered by the adults' cautious demeanor. One night, as the wind shrieked through the trees and the snow drifted in high, soft banks, a lone figure emerged from the forest. Lanterns were raised, axes gripped, hearts pounding in anticipation and fear. It was a hunter, breathless and pale, who reported what he had seen. Tracks larger than any man, deep in the snow, vanishing as suddenly as they had begun, leading toward the frozen pond. Bradford listened, his face grave but composed. "Providence tests us," he said quietly, "and yet it also teaches. We must endure, watch carefully, and care for one another." The settlers took turns keeping watch through the long nights, standing at the edge of the forest with lanterns raised, eyes straining through snow-laden branches. Each hour stretched interminably, the forest seeming to pulse with life and silence in equal measure. Shadows shifted beneath snow-laden boughs, the wind carried whispers that might have been voice or imagination, and the river ran beneath its frozen surface, patient and constant. On the third night of the storm, Nathaniel spotted movement at the pond. The ice, uneven and fractured beneath snow, gleamed with the ghostly reflection of the moon. There, standing near the far edge, was a figure, pale, still, unmistakably human. The lanterns trembled in their holders as the men approached cautiously. The figure turned, revealing the woodcutter's familiar face, eyes wide and unblinking, lips parting as if to speak. No sound emerged. Slowly, deliberately, he raised a hand, palm outward, a gesture of warning and recognition. Then, as if the forest itself had claimed him again, he stepped backward onto the ice, which shivered and groaned but held. One final breath of wind, and he was gone, leaving only the indentation of his boots in the snow. The settlers stood frozen, awe and fear mingling in the cold night air. The forest exhaled around them, indifferent, eternal, yet alive with mystery. Bradford placed a steady hand on Nathaniel's shoulder. "We do not always understand the ways of the world," he murmured. "Yet we endure, because we must, and because we are called to steward what has been given." When morning broke, pale and muted behind the lingering storm clouds, the settlement exhaled. Snow lay heavy upon rooftops and fields, yet life continued. Fires burned, animals were tended, and work resumed. The vanished woodcutter became part of the unspoken law of the settlement, a reminder of the forest's power, the fragility of life, and the necessity of courage and faith. In the long nights that followed, as wind and snow pressed against the cabins, the settlers learned anew the lessons of patience, vigilance, and unity. The colony had survived the long night once more, tempered by adversity and guided by providence, yet always aware that the wilderness, patient and eternal, held secrets beyond the reach of human understanding. Spring's first whisper arrived slowly, hesitating at the edges of the settlement. Snow lingered in shadowed hollows, yet sunlight stretched longer across the frozen fields, painting the world in pale gold. The river, once rigid with ice, began to flow again, carrying fragments of winter's debris downstream. The settlers emerged cautiously from their cabins, shoulders straight, eyes bright with tentative anticipation. The long, relentless grip of winter had loosened, leaving behind both fatigue and a fragile pride in their endurance. Bradford walked among the fields, noting the earliest shoots of green pushing through the thawed earth. The corn, beans, and squash planted before the frost had endured the winter's harsh bite. Each sprout felt like a small miracle, a testament to the labor, patience, and guidance of both the settlers and their allies in the Wampanoag. Squanto moved among them, quietly pointing to areas where soil needed loosening, where water pooled too heavily, where small adjustments could mean life or loss. The settlers listened intently, awe mingling with gratitude. Children ran between the cabins, their laughter a soft music against the still bright snow. Mary Whitfield helped the youngest gather kindling, her hands deft and steady. She looked up to see Nathaniel Briggs tossing his brother a small bundle of firewood, his face flushed with exertion and the excitement of seeing the first true signs of spring. For a moment, the hardships of winter seemed almost to vanish, replaced by the fragile warmth of hope. One afternoon, Bradford and William Brewster convened the council beneath the meeting house. They discussed provisions, planting schedules, and patrols along the forest's edge. Yet there was a new tone, a cautious optimism, a recognition that survival was not merely a sequence of trials, but a labor rewarded. "We have endured the worst," Bradford told the gathered men and women. "Now we plant not only for sustenance, but for the promise of life itself. Let every seed we place be an act of faith." Harvest began quietly, methodically. Families moved through the fields, gathering early shoots, turning soil, and laying down furrows for the next planting. Squanto guided hands as deftly as a teacher, explaining the subtle rhythms of planting with fish buried beneath hills to nourish roots, and the importance of spacing to allow each plant its share of sunlight and water. The settlers marveled at the precision of his methods, understanding that knowledge carried across generations often surpassed what any single winter could destroy. Evenings were now filled with soft songs, voices rising from cabins and hearths, mingling with the distant call of birds returning to trees. Fires burned brightly, warming faces and hearts alike, while the river hummed its eternal, patient song. Bradford recorded every detail in his journal, not only the growth of crops, the patterns of rain, or the behavior of animals, but the subtle transformation within the colony, the quiet cohesion of people bound by shared labor, trust, and perseverance. The first true celebration came as the snow receded entirely and the sun hung higher in the sky. The settlers gathered in the clearing, a modest feast of salted meats, fresh roots, and early vegetables. Children carried small baskets of berries, laughing at one another, while elders nodded in quiet satisfaction. Bradford addressed the assembly. "We give thanks for the Lord's providence, for the guidance of those who teach us, and for the endurance we have found within ourselves. Let this harvest remind us that life, though fragile, can flourish when tended with care, courage, and faith." As the feast continued, a gentle calm settled over the settlement. The forest stood beyond the clearing, dark and patient, yet no longer only a source of fear. Its shadows were reminders of mysteries respected, its trees guardians of lessons learned. The river, full and glinting in sunlight, spoke softly of continuity, persistence, and balance. Bradford, standing at the edge of the clearing, felt a deep sense of awe. The colony had survived not only winter's merciless grip, but the uncertainty of the land, the weight of alliances, and the ever-present shadow of the unknown. Hope had returned, fragile yet enduring, carried on the hands of settlers, the guidance of Squanto, and the unseen currents of Providence. Night fell slowly, stars piercing the clear sky, and the settlement settled under blankets of calm. Fires burned low, children dreamed, and adults rested with cautious relief. The forest whispered, the river glimmered, and the new world, vast and enigmatic, seemed for the first time to offer the settlers not only survival, but a promise that endurance, faith, and unity could cultivate life even in the harshest of lands. The promise of harvest brought both relief and tension. While the settlers rejoiced in the fruits of their labor, the long months of survival had left subtle fractures in the colony's unity. Even the strongest bonds, forged in the crucible of winter, were now tested by the pressures of governance, scarce resources, and differing visions for the future. Bradford felt the weight of leadership more keenly than ever. Providence had guided them through storms, famine, and frost. Yet human hearts were far less predictable than the forest or river. Rumors began quietly, whispered in corners and along narrow paths between cabins. Some questioned Bradford's strict oversight, wondering if his unwavering adherence to order left little room for individual initiative. Others murmured about Standish's patrols, about whether vigilance was necessary or excessive, whether the settlers were being prepared for enemies unseen rather than focusing on what they could control. Even Mary Whitfield and Nathaniel Briggs, devoted and steadfast, sensed the subtle undercurrent of unease, the fatigue of labor, the shadow of winter still present in memory, and the restlessness of those newly emboldened by spring's growth. One morning, Bradford convened the council beneath the wide beams of the meeting house. Lanterns cast warm light over faces lined with worry and resolve. "We are fortunate in our harvest," he began, voice steady, yet grave. "Yet fortune does not absolve us from vigilance, diligence, and patience. Discord, however small, weakens us. Every word, every action ripples through this settlement. We must act as one, guided by faith and reason alike." A heated discussion followed. Edward Winslow argued for caution, emphasizing the importance of following Squanto's guidance and maintaining close ties with Massasoit. Others, weary from labor and eager to explore new lands, pressed for expansion and independent action, hinting at a tension between communal order and personal ambition. Standish's hand rested lightly on the hilt of his sword, his eyes sharp, warning without words that discord could invite disaster. Nathaniel Briggs spoke quietly, yet with conviction. "We have seen what the forest and winter can do," he said. "We know the river can nourish and destroy. If we quarrel among ourselves, even small grievances can grow into calamity. We must remember the lessons of endurance, humility, and cooperation." Bradford nodded, grateful for the young man's insight. "Let us resolve not by authority alone, but by counsel, respect, and mutual understanding," he said. "Providence guides us, but it works through our actions, through our unity, and our care for one another." Despite these words, the unease did not vanish entirely. Over the following weeks, small conflicts emerged. Disputes over boundaries for planting, disagreements about hunting grounds, and occasional lapses in cooperation during construction or firewood gathering. Bradford, Brewster, and Winslow navigated these tensions with care, mediating conflicts, listening patiently, and reminding the settlers of the fragile covenant that bound them together. Yet the forest itself seemed to mirror the colony's unease. Tracks of deer and other game became irregular. The river swelled unexpectedly with late spring rains, and distant cries of birds, once cheerful, now carried a sharper, almost ominous edge. The settlers, accustomed to listening to the land for lessons, felt a subtle warning in every sound, every shadow, every unexpected drift of wind. One evening, after a long day of resolving disputes and tending to the fields, Bradford walked alone to the riverbank. Ice lingered in pockets along the edge, yet the water flowed with renewed strength, carrying fallen branches and new life downstream. He pressed his hands into the mud, feeling the pulse of the land beneath his palms. The forest murmured in the twilight, reminding him that endurance required both vigilance and humility, both leadership and compassion. As night fell, the settlement settled under clear skies, lanterns glowing softly against the darkening horizon. Fires burned in every cabin, voices murmured prayers, and children slept fitfully, dreaming of warmth and safety. The shadows of discord lingered, yet they did not overwhelm. The colony had survived winter, had forged alliances, and had endured the tests of a harsh land. With care, faith, and diligence, they would navigate the challenges within, just as they had survived the forces without. Bradford lifted his eyes to the stars, noting their constancy amid change. The new world remained vast, mysterious, and alive. Its lessons were never complete, its trials never ending. But for the settlers of Plymouth, every hardship and every triumph carved the story of survival, courage, and the enduring human spirit. The promise of harvest brought both relief and tension. While the settlers rejoiced in the fruits of their labor, the long months of survival had left subtle fractures in the colony's unity. Even the strongest bonds, forged in the crucible of winter, were now tested by the pressures of governance, scarce resources, and differing visions for the future. Bradford felt the weight of leadership more keenly than ever. Providence had guided them through storms, famine, and frost. Yet human hearts were far less predictable than the forest or river. Rumors began quietly, whispered in corners and along narrow paths between cabins. Some questioned Bradford's strict oversight, wondering if his unwavering adherence to order left little room for individual initiative. Others murmured about Standish's patrols, about whether vigilance was necessary or excessive, whether the settlers were being prepared for enemies unseen, rather than focusing on what they could control. Even Mary Whitfield and Nathaniel Briggs, devoted and steadfast, sensed the subtle undercurrent of unease, the fatigue of labor, the shadow of winter still present in memory, and the restlessness of those newly emboldened by spring's growth. One morning, Bradford convened the council beneath the wide beams of the meeting house. Lanterns cast warm light over faces lined with worry and resolve. "We are fortunate in our harvest," he began, voice steady yet grave. "Yet fortune does not absolve us from vigilance, diligence, and patience. Discord, however small, weakens us. Every word, every action ripples through this settlement. We must act as one, guided by faith and reason alike." A heated discussion followed. Edward Winslow argued for caution, emphasizing the importance of following Squanto's guidance and maintaining close ties with Massasoit. Others, weary from labor and eager to explore new lands, pressed for expansion and independent action, hinting at a tension between communal order and personal ambition. Standish's hand rested lightly on the hilt of his sword, his eyes sharp, warning without words that discord could invite disaster. Nathaniel Briggs spoke quietly, yet with conviction. "We have seen what the forest and winter can do," he said. "We know the river can nourish and destroy. If we quarrel among ourselves, even small grievances can grow into calamity. We must remember the lessons of endurance, humility, and cooperation." Bradford nodded, grateful for the young man's insight. "Let us resolve not by authority alone, but by counsel, respect, and mutual understanding," he said. "Providence guides us, but it works through our actions, through our unity and our care for one another." Despite these words, the unease did not vanish entirely. Over the following weeks, small conflicts emerged, disputes over boundaries for planting, disagreements about hunting grounds, and occasional lapses in cooperation during construction or firewood gathering. Bradford, Brewster, and Winslow navigated these tensions with care, mediating conflicts, listening patiently, and reminding the settlers of the fragile covenant that bound them together. Yet the forest itself seemed to mirror the colony's unease. Tracks of deer and other game became irregular. The river swelled unexpectedly with late spring rains, and distant cries of birds, once cheerful, now carried a sharper, almost ominous edge. The settlers, accustomed to listening to the land for lessons, felt a subtle warning in every sound, every shadow, every unexpected drift of wind. One evening, after a long day of resolving disputes and tending to the fields, Bradford walked alone to the riverbank. Ice lingered in pockets along the edge, yet the water flowed with renewed strength, carrying fallen branches and new life downstream. He pressed his hands into the mud, feeling the pulse of the land beneath his palms. The forest murmured in the twilight, reminding him that endurance required both vigilance and humility, both leadership and compassion. As night fell, the settlement settled under clear skies, lanterns glowing softly against the darkening horizon. Fires burned in every cabin, voices murmured prayers, and children slept fitfully, dreaming of warmth and safety. The shadows of discord lingered, yet they did not overwhelm. The colony had survived winter, had forged alliances, and had endured the tests of a harsh land. With care, faith, and diligence, they would navigate the challenges within, just as they had survived the forces without. Bradford lifted his eyes to the stars, noting their constancy amid change. The new world remained vast, mysterious, and alive. Its lessons were never complete, its trials never ending. But for the settlers of Plymouth, every hardship and every triumph carved the story of survival, courage, and the enduring human spirit. Summer deepened across Plymouth, painting the clearing in vivid greens and golds. Cornstalks swayed with the river's breeze, beans clung to their poles, and squash leaves spread wide, glistening with morning dew. Children ran barefoot along earthen paths, laughter ringing like wind chimes, while the settlers moved with quiet purpose, tending fields, repairing roofs, and maintaining the fragile rhythm of life. Yet beneath the sunlit serenity, the forest whispered in its ancient, patient way. Shadows shifted unnaturally in the understory. The wind carried sounds that resembled voices just beyond comprehension. Hunters reported fleeting impressions of movement, glimpses of figures disappearing behind trees, deer startled into erratic flight, or strange tracks, larger than any man, irregular, and vanishing suddenly into brush. Even Squanto paused, eyes narrowing, hands gesturing toward the forest with unspoken caution. Bradford sensed the tension as acutely as any outward sign. He walked along the riverbank one evening, journal in hand, recording the patterns of wildlife, the flow of water, and the subtle anomalies reported by hunters. Each detail, each shadow, he knew, could signal danger, or simply the land itself asserting its will. The settlers had learned that observation, patience, and humility were as vital as axes and plows. One afternoon, a small hunting party returned shaken. They had tracked a deer through a dense copse, only to find the creature vanished without trace, and beside its tracks were marks unlike any they had seen. Deep impressions, rounded yet elongated, spaced irregularly, as if the forest itself had stepped into the clearing. The men shared their account in hushed tones, glancing at one another and then at Bradford, who absorbed the details with calm intensity. "We must not let fear rule our hearts," Bradford said firmly, yet gently. "But we must respect the forest, and respect also the signs it offers. Vigilance is wisdom, and caution is not cowardice." That evening, the settlers gathered in the meeting house, the lantern light flickering over tired yet attentive faces. William Brewster spoke of prayers and guidance, encouraging reflection on providence, while Miles Standish outlined patrols and precautionary measures, emphasizing careful observation without unnecessary confrontation. Nathaniel Briggs and Mary Whitfield worked quietly alongside the children, reinforcing the value of discipline and unity while maintaining the warmth of daily life. In the nights that followed, subtle omens continued. Fires in the settlement flickered strangely, as if shadows themselves held secret motion. A sudden cry of an owl or the distant howl of a wolf seemed almost articulate, carrying meaning that eluded comprehension. And yet, amid these signs, life went on. Crops matured under careful tending, fish were gathered from the river, and alliances with Massasoit's people remained strong, reinforced through trade, counsel, and shared labor. Bradford often retreated to the riverbank at dusk, listening to the flowing water and the forest's murmurs. He felt a kinship with the land, a recognition that the new world, vast and indifferent, offered both sustenance and challenge, comfort and uncertainty. Here, every season taught lessons: patience, humility, resilience, and the balance between human ambition and the quiet will of nature. One night, as a gentle mist rose from the river and the stars glittered coldly above, Bradford recorded in his journal, "The forest whispers not in threats alone, but in truths hidden to those who will not observe. Every shadow, every silence, every sound carries counsel for those patient enough to listen. We endure not merely through labor or faith, but through the harmony we maintain with this land and its people." Even as mysteries lingered at the forest's edge, the settlers' confidence grew. They understood now that vigilance and respect must coexist with hope and joy, that every day of labor brought them closer to stability, and that unity among themselves and with their Wampanoag allies was the truest safeguard against the unknown. As summer reached its zenith, Plymouth basked in the delicate balance between abundance and uncertainty. The corn stood tall, beans climbed steadily, and children's laughter rose above the whispered rustle of leaves. Bradford, standing at the clearing's edge, eyes fixed on the shimmering river, felt the profound pulse of life and endurance. Fragile, yet relentless, human, and eternal. The warmth of summer carried both bounty and unease. While fields flourished and the river offered plentiful fish, Plymouth was never immune to the caprices of the land or the hidden dangers that lay beyond the clearing. One morning, a dense smoke began to curl along the horizon. red gold in the rising sun. It was faint at first, almost ignorable, but Bradford's eyes, trained in observation, narrowed with concern. Fires in the forest could spread with terrifying speed. A moment's delay might cost both lives and harvest. Miles Standish quickly organized a team to investigate. Men and older boys carried buckets, axes, and spades, moving along the edge of the forest with calculated caution. As they approached, the crackle of flame became audible, the pungent scent of burning pine filling the air. The fire, fed by dry underbrush and a sudden gust of wind, threatened to leap toward the settlement's outskirts. Bradford rallied families, instructing them to move livestock and secure supplies, while others formed a bucket brigade, shuttling water from the river with swift, measured strokes. Squanto arrived alongside Massasoit's warriors, their presence both reassuring and formidable. Together, settlers and Wampanoag coordinated, creating fire breaks, clearing brush, and dousing flames that sought to consume the land's generosity. The effort was exhausting. Sweat mixed with smoke, hands blistered, backs ached, and eyes stung. Yet despite the fear and physical strain, the colony endured, united in a purpose larger than themselves. Amid the chaos, Bradford noticed something else: human eyes observing from beyond the tree line. Shadows shifted unnaturally, figures retreating when approached, only to reappear at a distance. Tensions rose, whispers of trespassers or potential hostility circulating among the settlers. Yet Standish, ever prudent, counseled caution. "Let us fight the fire first," he said. "The forest tests us now. Speculation can wait." Hours passed with relentless labor. Children were kept safely within cabins under Mary Whitfield's watchful eyes, while elders and council members rotated through the brigade, ensuring that no one collapsed from exhaustion. Slowly, the flames were brought under control, smoke curling skyward in diminishing tendrils. The river's cool water and quick coordination had saved the settlement from disaster, but the day left a mark on every face: relief mixed with weariness, pride laced with apprehension. That evening, as fires burned low in hearths and the first meal after the ordeal was shared, Bradford convened the council in the meeting house. The air smelled of soot, wood, and sweat. Faces were streaked with ash, yet eyes glimmered with quiet triumph. "Today," Bradford began, voice steady but solemn, "we have witnessed both the mercy and the danger of this land. We have endured because of diligence, unity, and the guidance of those who walk with us in trust. Let this lesson remain. Providence favors neither the careless nor the divided. Our survival demands courage, respect, and vigilance in all things." Massasoit's emissaries sat among the settlers, silent but watchful. Squanto translated, reminding both sides of the forest's lessons. Fire is a force of destruction, but it can be countered through cooperation. The land is generous, yet indifferent. The bonds of alliance are stronger than fear when reinforced by action and trust. Bradford noted each gesture, each phrase, aware that the subtleties of diplomacy and human connection were as crucial as the physical work required to protect the colony. In the days that followed, Plymouth recovered. Burnt underbrush was cleared, seeds replanted, and fire breaks reinforced. The incident became both cautionary tale and testament to collective endurance. Yet the shadow of the forest persisted, a constant reminder that survival demanded humility, respect, and unceasing attention. Children played again in cleared fields. Songs returned to the cabins, and the river's steady hum lulled settlers into the fragile comfort of evening. Bradford, seated by the riverbank one dusky night, journal open on his lap, reflected upon the day. The fire had been both trial and teacher, revealing strength, unity, and the quiet persistence of human spirit. Yet he understood that Plymouth's story remained unfinished. Nature's challenges were never over, and human conflicts, subtle or overt, could erupt at any moment. The New World, vast, beautiful, and indifferent, demanded endurance, wisdom, and an unshakable commitment to both labor and faith. The scars of fire had barely faded when the settlers turned their attention to gratitude, reflection, and renewal. Summer deepened, and with it came an air of tentative celebration. The crops, resilient and verdant, swayed in gentle breezes. The river shimmered under sunlight, alive with fish once again abundant. The forest, scarred but enduring, whispered with renewed energy. Bradford recognized that survival was not merely a succession of days, but a continuous interplay between labor, foresight, and the bonds shared among people. Preparations for a communal feast began early, each family contributing labor, food, and time. Corn, beans, squash, and fish were gathered with care, while wild berries and greens added color and sweetness. Loaves baked in earthen ovens, salted meats were roasted, and herbs, both familiar and learned from Wampanoag allies, infused the air with fragrant complexity. Children scurried with baskets of berries, laughter mingling with the hum of labor and the soft clatter of tools. Squanto and Massasoit arrived with their people, carrying gifts of furs, smoked fish, and lessons learned through generations of survival. Their presence was a living reminder of the delicate diplomacy and respect necessary in this new land. Bradford welcomed them warmly, exchanging gestures and words that bridged language and culture, fostering mutual understanding and trust. As the feast commenced beneath a clear azure sky, the settlers and their allies sat together in long rows of benches and tables. Fires crackled in controlled hearths, their warmth lending comfort and light. Bradford rose to speak, voice carrying over the gathered crowd. Friends, neighbors, and allies, today we gather not merely to celebrate the fruits of our labor, but the endurance, courage, and unity that have brought us to this moment. Winter tested our strength, fire tested our resolve, and the forest has reminded us that life is both precious and fragile. Yet here we are, stronger, wiser, and more connected than before. Let this feast honor not only our survival, but the bonds that sustain it. The settlers responded with quiet applause, smiles mingling with nods of agreement. Children clapped their small hands, squealing with delight as bread and berries were passed. Squanto offered a prayer in his language, invoking blessings of growth, protection, and harmony. Massasoit translated for the English, and a ripple of understanding and gratitude moved through the crowd. Food was shared generously. Hands passed baskets of corn and beans, platters of fish and roasted meats, and bowls of berries sweetened by sun and rain. Stories were told of the past months, the vanishing woodcutter, the trials of winter, the fires of early summer, and the subtle signs of the forest. Each tale carried lessons, laughter, and awe, binding the community through shared memory and reflection. As night approached, lanterns glimmered like scattered stars, and fires burned steadily. The river reflected the glow, rippling with light and shadow. Children were led to beds of straw, lulled by the rhythm of conversation and the distant murmur of the river. Adults lingered, speaking quietly of plans, hopes, and the next season's labor. Bradford stood at the edge of the clearing, gazing at the forest beyond, feeling the pulse of the land and the heartbeat of the colony intertwined. He recorded in his journal, "Unity is our greatest safeguard. Providence provides lessons through fire, frost, and shadow. Yet it is our hearts, our hands, and our collective will that translate these lessons into survival. Tonight, we feast not only on food, but on trust, courage, and shared endeavor. May these bonds endure as steadfastly as the river flows and the forest whispers." For a brief moment, the trials of the past, fear, hunger, discord, and fire, were tempered by laughter, song, and the warmth of companionship. The new world remained vast, mysterious, and at times indifferent. Yet within Plymouth, life thrived in the careful balance of faith, diligence, and connection. And as the fires dimmed and the stars rose high, the settlers understood that their story, though unfinished, was rich with lessons, resilience, and the quiet, enduring promise of human perseverance. As summer waned, Plymouth settled into a rhythm of labor, learning, and vigilance. The days remained long and warm, But the mornings carried a hint of chill, and the shadows beneath the forest canopy deepened, stretching across the ground like quiet warnings. Bradford walked the outskirts of the settlement, eyes scanning tree lines, listening to the whisper of leaves, the distant call of crows, and the subtle creaking of branches. The forest, alive with secrets and movement, reminded him that the new world had not yet revealed all its lessons. Hunters reported unusual signs along familiar paths. Tracks appeared and vanished without clear pattern, and small game behaved erratically, as if sensing something unseen. Even the Wampanoag expressed concern. Squanto, his face somber beneath the brim of his hat, gestured to deep impressions in soft soil and areas where undergrowth had been trampled. "The forest speaks," he said quietly, "but its voice is not always clear to those who listen hastily." Bradford convened a council beneath the wide beams of the meeting house. Lantern light danced across furrowed faces. Miles Standish proposed increased patrols, and several settlers voiced concern about potential intruders, strangers from distant settlements, or perhaps discontented souls wandering the wilderness. Yet Bradford, balancing caution with reason, emphasized careful observation and calm judgment. "We have endured the trials of winter, the fires of summer, and the subtleties of human discord," he said. "Now we must endure the subtle signs of the forest and the unknown, with eyes open and hearts steady." That afternoon, a scouting party discovered a cluster of saplings bent and broken, forming an unnatural pattern near the eastern edge of the forest. Nathaniel Briggs and others examined the site with care. Among the saplings were larger, deeper impressions in the soil, too wide for men, too deliberate to be mere animal tracks. Whispers of unease circulated. The settlers understood that life in this land demanded respect for both its beauty and its dangers. Nightfall brought long shadows and a dense fog rolling in from the river. Lanterns flickered along paths as families returned to cabins, children holding tightly to the hands of parents. Fires burned in hearths, casting warm pools of light in contrast to the cold, uncertain darkness beyond. Even the bravest hunters lingered near cabins longer than usual, and Bradford walked among the dwellings, ensuring reassurance, listening, and recording every detail in his journal. As the moon rose, a distant cry broke the stillness, a sound neither fully human nor entirely animal, echoing through the fog. Settlers paused, hearts quickened, yet no one rushed. Standish gathered a small guard, moving carefully toward the sound, while Bradford, at the edge of the clearing, urged caution. They approached the river's bend, where mist clung to reeds and the water moved silently. There, they discovered nothing but a fallen branch, broken reeds, and the faint trace of tracks leading back toward the deeper forest. Relief mingled with tension. The forest had spoken again, yet in riddles. Bradford reflected on the day's events. The forest was both a teacher and a mirror, reflecting the fears, hopes, and patience of those who dwelled near it. He recorded, "The forest tests us in silence, in absence, in what it withholds. Endurance is not merely labor, nor courage merely action. It is patience, observation, and respect for that which we cannot wholly understand. Here, every shadow is counsel, every sound a lesson." In the following weeks, the settlers reinforced vigilance without succumbing to fear. Patrols moved at dawn and dusk, crops were protected with care, and families continued their daily labors, weaving a balance between productivity, observation, and trust. Children, taught to respect both forest and river, played with greater attentiveness, learning early that the land's lessons were subtle yet vital. Despite the undercurrent of unease, Plymouth remained a community bound by resilience and unity. Each challenge, the forest's whispers, unexplained tracks, or sudden disturbances, reinforced the settlers' reliance on one another, on the guidance of Squanto, and on Bradford's measured leadership. The new world remained vast, mysterious, and indifferent. Yet within the settlement, life endured, shaped by vigilance, courage, and the quiet wisdom that came from listening deeply to both nature and neighbor. Autumn arrived quietly, as if the land itself exhaled after the exertions of summer. the forest transformed into a mosaic of amber, crimson, and gold, leaves drifting lazily to the earth like fragments of fire. The air carried a crispness that pricked the lungs and brought colour to cheeks, while the river's currents slowed, reflecting the lowered sun and the gentle sway of trees along its banks. Plymouth, resilient and vigilant, felt both the relief and the solemnity that fall brought. Bradford walked among the cabins, noting preparations for the colder months ahead. Families gathered corn into cribs, dried beans over hearths, and stored squash and root vegetables in cool, shaded cellars. Fish were smoked and salted, and firewood was stacked in careful rows. Even as labour continued, there was a distinct sense of reflection, a recognition that the land's generosity was finite, and that every provision required gratitude, effort, and foresight. The children's laughter remained, but their play now included lessons of preparation. Dragging small bundles of firewood, carrying water, or observing elders' methods for preserving crops. Mary Whitfield taught herbs' properties, explaining which could strengthen bodies against illness and which could be used in modest remedies. Nathaniel Briggs, energetic yet thoughtful, guided small groups to inspect traps and nets, ensuring that sustenance would remain available even when the river froze in winter. Bradford, journal in hand, recorded both the tangible and subtle changes. Autumn speaks in colour and scent, in crisp air and falling leaves. It reminds us that life, though fragile, endures in cycles, that effort begets provision, and that vigilance sustains both body and spirit. The land teaches patience, humility, and care, lessons we must never abandon. Among the settlers, subtle tensions lingered. Some, emboldened by months of survival, advocated expansion, clearing new fields, venturing deeper into the forest, or exploring beyond known riverbanks. Others urged caution, citing the forest's hidden dangers, unexplained tracks, and the lessons whispered through fire, frost, and shadows. Council meetings grew more deliberate, voices tempered by experience and the quiet authority of Bradford, whose leadership was both measured and compassionate. The Wampanoag remained integral to these discussions. Massasoit and his advisors shared knowledge of seasonal shifts, which areas of the forest were rich in game, which river bends provided the best fish, and where frost might strike earliest. Squanto, patient and observant, guided settlers in refining planting techniques, constructing sturdier storage, and understanding the forest's rhythms. Bonds strengthened not merely through shared labor, but through mutual respect and recognition of each culture's strengths. One morning, a hunting party reported signs of intrusion deeper in the forest. Footprints unfamiliar in shape, a faint smell of smoke, and broken branches forming an unnatural pattern. Bradford convened a council immediately, balancing caution with reason. Standish prepared a small patrol to investigate, while Bradford emphasized observation and non-aggressive response unless threatened. He reminded the settlers, "We are guests in this land. Respect, prudence, and unity remain our greatest safeguards." As the sun set, the colony gathered once more beside the river. Fires burned in hearths and lanterns glimmered in cabins. Families shared stories of the day's labor, children recounted moments of discovery, and elders imparted wisdom earned from months of trial. Bradford walked among them, noting the mixture of fatigue, satisfaction, and quiet vigilance on each face. The new world, vast and unpredictable, remained indifferent, yet the colony endured, learning to navigate both bounty and challenge with courage, patience, and faith. The turning of the leaves mirrored the turning of lives, growth tempered by caution, abundance accompanied by reflection, and the unyielding rhythm of survival, bound to both land and human effort. Bradford, standing at the edge of the clearing, watched amber leaves drift onto the river, understanding that each season brought not only provision but lessons. The forest whispered still, shadows lengthened, yet within Plymouth, life thrived, fragile, precious, and enduring. The air grew sharper as autumn waned, carrying with it the first unmistakable hints of frost. Morning breaths hovered like smoke, delicate and ephemeral, and the grass shimmered with tiny crystals of ice. The settlers noticed the change in every detail, the subtle stiffening of leaves, the chill that lingered in shaded corners, and the river's slower, heavier current. Bradford understood that the coming months would demand vigilance, preparation, and steadfast unity. Families worked tirelessly, gathering the last of the harvest and ensuring that food stores were sufficient to carry them through the winter. Corn was husked and cribs filled to the brim. Beans were threaded and hung to dry. Squash and root vegetables were stored in cool cellars lined with straw. Fish were salted in barrels, and small preserves of berries and herbs were prepared with meticulous care. Even the children, keen observers of adult labor, were enlisted in minor but meaningful tasks, moving firewood, carrying water, and ensuring that young seedlings were protected from early frost. Bradford's journal became a reflection not only of survival but of human resilience. "Frost approaches," he wrote one morning, "and with it comes the need for foresight. The land provides, yet it is indifferent. We endure not merely through labor, but through care, planning, and the quiet diligence that transforms labor into sustenance. Providence guides, yet we must act as guardians of ourselves, our families, and our covenant." Squanto and Massasoit's people continued to offer guidance, showing settlers which herbs retained potency in the cold, where root vegetables could be safely stored underground, and how smoke could deter predators from barns and granaries. Their knowledge of the cycles of the land, gathered over generations, proved invaluable. Bradford marveled at the depth of wisdom held within his allies, understanding that survival in this new world required not only effort, but humility and the willingness to learn. Yet the forest, patient and unpredictable, reminded them that danger lingered even amid preparation. Hunters reported deeper tracks of wolves, larger than any seen before, and the unusual behavior of deer suggested subtle pressures from predators or changes in the forest itself. Shadows lengthened earlier each evening, and even the familiar sounds of river and wind carried an edge of unpredictability. Standish organized patrols, guiding men along perimeter paths, and instructed all settlers in defensive awareness, reinforcing that vigilance must accompany labor if the colony was to endure. One evening, as a thin mist rose from the river, Bradford walked quietly along its edge, notebook in hand. The air smelled of wet earth, fallen leaves, and the faint hint of smoke from distant hearths. He paused, listening to the soft rush of water over stones, the rustle of trees, and the distant cry of an owl. Each sound, each subtle shift in the environment, was a lesson, a reminder that life in this land demanded attentiveness, patience, and respect. At the settlement, families gathered around fires each night, sharing warmth, conversation, and simple meals. Children were tucked into beds of straw, lulled by the rhythm of conversation, the crackle of flames, and the distant murmur of the river. Bradford, seated near the hearth of his own cabin, reflected on the cycle of seasons and the fragile endurance of human effort. He wrote, "Winter approaches not merely as a season, but as a test. Every provision, every lesson learned, every bond of trust and cooperation is now measured against frost and shadow. Endurance is our shield, unity our strength, and care our guide." As the first frost kissed rooftops and fields, Plymouth prepared for the months ahead with steady hands and steady hearts. The new world, vast and impartial, offered both bounty and challenge. Yet the colony had learned to navigate its rhythms, to labor with diligence, to observe with patience, and to trust in both providence and the bonds forged among settlers and allies. The approaching winter would be another chapter in their story, testing the lessons of the past, yet the colony remained steadfast, guided by courage, wisdom, and enduring hope. The first true winter arrived with solemn authority, blanketing Plymouth in a quiet hush. Snow fell steadily, layering fields, rooftops, and trees in brilliant white, muting sound and softening edges. The river slowed beneath thin sheets of ice, its surface reflecting the pale winter sun, dimmed and distant. The forest, stripped of leaves, appeared both stark and infinite, its bare branches etching delicate patterns against the grey sky. In this frozen world, Plymouth's settlers faced their greatest test since arriving: the relentless rigour of winter and the demands it placed upon body, mind, and spirit. Morning routines took on new gravity. Families stoked hearths long before sunrise, ensuring warmth would reach each corner of the cabins. Children, bundled in layers of wool and fur, carried kindling, fetched water from carefully cleared paths, and observed adults with solemn curiosity. Women prepared nourishing broths and porridge, blending vegetables preserved through autumn with salted fish, dried beans, and herbs that retained potency in cold. Men patrolled the perimeter, checking traps, reinforcing shelters, and scanning the horizon for signs of predators or drifting snowdrifts that might block paths or access to the river. Bradford, walking through the settlement as the dawn light reflected off fresh snow, felt both awe and concern. Each cabin bore evidence of preparation and care, yet the land demanded more than diligence. It demanded endurance. Winter is a teacher without mercy, he noted in his journal, yet it also tempers the spirit. In its cold, we discover the limits of flesh and the depths of community. Our survival is neither granted nor guaranteed, but earned through labor, foresight, and unity. The Wampanoag remained indispensable. Squanto guided settlers in constructing snow shelters and insulating cabins, demonstrating how to use earth, branches, and leaves to retain warmth. Massasoit shared lessons on tracking game in snow, predicting its movement, and avoiding pitfalls that frost and ice created in familiar paths. Their presence reminded Plymouth settlers that wisdom, gained over generations, could transform uncertainty into opportunity. Even amid preparation, danger and challenge were constant companions. Wolves, emboldened by the scarcity of prey, pressed closer to cleared fields and cabins. Hunters reported that deer moved erratically, fleeing in unusual patterns, and occasionally, distant cries, human or animal, echoed across the frozen forest, leaving hearts taut with tension. Standish, vigilant and precise, organized nightly patrols while training younger men in observation and careful response. Every sound, shadow and step became a lesson in attentiveness, an exercise in the discipline of survival. Inside the cabins, however, life maintained rhythm and humanity. Fires burned steadily, and families gathered to tell stories of seasons past, recount tales of providence, and share small comforts, woven mats, carved wooden toys, and songs of home. Children listened with wide eyes as elders spoke of voyages across the ocean, the trials of early settlement, and the subtle signs that guided life in this new land. Even the simplest story became a lesson in endurance, courage, and the interwoven lives of those who shared the clearing. One particularly bitter morning, a storm descended from the north, fierce and unrelenting. Wind tore across the settlement, snow drifted high against cabins, and the river's surface vanished beneath thick ice. Bradford coordinated efforts to secure supplies, strengthen structures, and assist neighbors whose roofs or shelters bore the storm's force. Hours passed in cold, focused labor. Hands became numb, faces stung with frostbite's promise, yet the settlers endured, drawing strength from one another and from the quiet guidance of Providence. When the storm subsided, the colony emerged, battered but unbroken. The snow-crusted forest sparkled in the sun, silent save for the river's tentative current and the occasional bird venturing through pale branches. Bradford recorded in his journal, "Winter tests all that we have built, our stores, our structures, our resolve. Yet it also teaches the measure of our courage, the depth of our bonds, and the steadiness of our hearts. In the frost we learn to endure. In the cold we discover warmth in one another." Night fell early, blanketing Plymouth in stillness. Fires burned low, yet each cabin radiated a quiet resilience. Children slept beneath thick blankets. Parents whispered prayers, and Bradford, at the edge of the clearing, gazed across the snowy expanse. The forest stood silent, majestic and indifferent. The river reflected the pale moon, and the settlement, small yet determined, endured. Winter's embrace had arrived, fierce and immutable, yet Plymouth had met it with vigilance, unity, and an unshakable will to survive. The heart of winter descended upon Plymouth with a silence both beautiful and severe. Snow piled against cabins in soft, suffocating drifts, blanketing the fields and bending tree branches beneath its weight. The river, once lively and flowing, now lay heavy and grey beneath sheets of ice, only a few fissures hinting at movement beneath. The wind howled in hollow passages through the forest, carrying flakes like sparks of frozen ash. It was a time when endurance was tested to its very limits, and the settlers learned anew the fragile measure of life in this new world. The long nights pressed heavily against each cabin. Inside, fires glowed warmly, yet the shadows seemed to linger, creeping along walls, mingling with the scent of smoke, stew, and wood. Families huddled, wrapped in layers of blankets, while children listened to tales of providence and survival, stories both cautionary and inspiring. Elderly settlers, their hands gnarled from labor, moved quietly between hearths, offering advice, tending small injuries, and keeping spirits steady. Every moment of warmth and comfort was hard-won, a product of foresight, effort, and care. Bradford, vigilant as ever, rose before dawn to check on the settlement. Paths were cleared for movement, snow piled away from entrances, and provisions redistributed to ensure no family went lacking. He paused to observe the horizon, noting the paleness of the sun against the icy sky and the rigid outlines of distant trees. In his journal, he wrote, "The night stretches long, yet each act of preparation, each watchful hour, bears fruit in the form of safety, warmth, and endurance. Here we meet the measure of our labor, tempered by the frost and sustained by unity." The forest, stark and crystalline under frost, continued to teach through absence as much as presence. Tracks in the snow, some familiar, some foreign, hinted at creatures moving unseen. Wolves circled cautiously, driven by hunger and instinct, yet deterred by the watchful eyes of hunters and the careful placement of traps. Occasional flocks of birds, resilient and bright against the grey, provided both sustenance and small reminders of life's persistence. Even in barrenness, the land spoke of balance, resilience, and hidden abundance. Inside the settlement, vigilance mingled with small celebrations of survival. The first snowfall had frightened many, but the ability to endure brought its own quiet pride. Families shared what little warmth and comfort remained, dividing food with careful thought, offering blankets, and tending fires long into the night. Conversations often lingered on memories of the voyage, the trials of early settlement, and the subtler lessons of each season. Bradford encouraged reflection, urging settlers to observe not only the forest and weather, but also their own capacity for resilience and compassion. One particularly severe night, a fierce blizzard struck without warning. Snow whipped in jagged sheets, obscuring vision, and the wind tore at doors and shutters with relentless force. Families huddled together, holding children close, whispering prayers into the roar of the storm. Standish and a small patrol moved cautiously to check on exposed cabins, ensuring fires burned and supplies remained accessible. The colony's endurance was measured not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, determined acts of tending, guarding, and supporting one another. When dawn finally arrived, revealing a settlement coated in a thick white stillness, a sense of triumph mingled with exhaustion. The storm had tested them, yet Plymouth endured. Bradford surveyed the landscape. Trees bowed beneath snow, tracks crisscrossed frozen fields, and smoke rose from cabins, curling in delicate spirals. He wrote in his journal, "The long night has passed. In its frozen grasp, we discovered the depth of our strength, the patience of our hearts, and the quiet power of unity. Providence guides us, yet it is through one another that we endure." In the following days, as the storm settled into a lingering frost, the settlers continued labor with steady purpose. Supplies were reinforced, patrols maintained, and the community's bonds strengthened by shared hardship. Children learned the rhythm of care, watching elders and participating in small, meaningful acts of labor. Every day became a testament to endurance, every night a lesson in vigilance, patience, and trust. Plymouth, framed against the stark beauty of winter, was small yet resolute. Life persisted in every hearth, every hand, and every cautious step across the frozen clearing. The new world remained indifferent, vast, and challenging. Yet the colony, guided by courage, foresight, and unity, continued to thrive. Even in the harshest nights, they discovered warmth in companionship, wisdom in observation, and the enduring promise of survival. Spring's first whispers arrived like a hesitant promise, delicate and soft against the hard edges of winter's remnants. Snow melted slowly, revealing dark, damp soil beneath, scented with the faint musk of decay and the quiet fragrance of new growth. The river stirred with renewed life, ice breaking in sheets and drifting downstream, carrying reflections of early sun that gleamed like scattered silver. Plymouth, tested by frost and storm, now breathed with cautious relief, each thawed morning signaling opportunity and hope. Families ventured beyond cabin doors with renewed energy, boots squelching in soft mud as they surveyed the land. Corn cribs emptied during the long months of frost were replenished with careful rations. Fish traps were checked and repaired. Livestock tended through winter, grazed on shoots of new grass with tentative delight. Even the children noticed the change. The sharp cold softened, birds returned with song, and buds emerged on branches once bare, painting the forest in faint green whispers. Bradford moved along familiar paths, journal in hand, observing both the settlement and the forest. Every detail, drifting frost, returning insects, tracks of deer, was noted with the precision of one who had witnessed the extremes of winter. The thaw reminds us, he wrote, that life endures, that labor is rewarded, and that each season teaches in its own measure. Winter's trial is past, yet its lessons remain. Diligence, patience, and unity are not seasonal, but enduring. The settlers, emboldened by survival, began early planting. Squanto guided them in selecting soils enriched by the melt, explaining which seeds would germinate quickly and which required careful spacing to ensure abundance. The Wampanoag's knowledge proved invaluable. Techniques for soil preparation, water management, and companion planting balanced the English settlers' traditions with the wisdom of the land's first people. Massasoit's presence was steady and calm, a reminder that alliances were as essential to survival as labor or harvest. Yet the thaw brought new challenges alongside opportunity. Mud and runoff created treacherous paths, slowing transport and testing patience. Wolves and other predators, emerging from the forest's deep cover, pressed cautiously toward the settlement, drawn by the promise of easier prey after months of scarcity. Standish, vigilant and methodical, led patrols, reinforced barriers, and ensured that traps and early warning measures were maintained. Every precaution reflected the settlers' hard-earned understanding. Survival in the new world demanded constant attention to both environment and circumstance. Inside the cabins, life became quieter, reflective, and filled with preparation for growth. Meals incorporated the first green shoots, preserved vegetables from winter, and the occasional fresh fish or fowl. Fires burned in hearths long into the evening, casting light against walls and warming hands chilled by labor. Children, still learning the rhythm of the seasons, observed their elders with curiosity, absorbing lessons that went beyond planting or tending. Every gesture, passing a basket, sharpening a tool, sharing bread, was a subtle lesson in endurance, cooperation, and the careful stewardship of life. Bradford, seated beneath a rising sun one morning, recorded the scene in his journal. The thaw brings more than water and growth. It brings reflection and renewal. Winter has tested our strength, patience, and unity. Now, as the land awakens, we must nurture not only our crops and animals, but also the bonds forged in cold, the lessons learned in frost, and the wisdom gained through endurance. The New World remains vast and indifferent, yet within these clearings, life persists, cultivated by care, courage, and faith. In the weeks that followed, Plymouth settlement flourished quietly. Seeds sprouted, fires warmed cabins, and children ran freely across the slowly drying fields. The settlers celebrated small victories. The first shoots of corn, the first catch of fish in thawed waters, and the safe passage of all families through the harsh winter. Laughter, tentative at first, grew louder with each passing day, mingling with the song of returning birds and the hum of river currents. Though the land remained unpredictable, the thaw signaled not only relief, but a deepened understanding. Survival was not merely a sequence of labor and seasons, but a delicate balance of observation, humility, community, and the quiet, persistent courage to endure. Plymouth, resilient and watchful, had met winter's trial and now faced spring with steady hearts and unwavering resolve, aware that each new season would demand both wisdom and steadfast unity. Spring deepened, and with it came a sense of cautious triumph. The forest, once stark and forbidding under winter's weight, now shimmered with tender green. Buds unfurling on branches, wildflowers peeking through damp soil, and ferns uncurling in shaded hollows. The settlers of Plymouth moved with renewed purpose, aware that survival in the New World demanded not only labor, but attentiveness, patience, and the wisdom to learn from each season's trials. Families gathered along the riverbanks, repairing boats, checking fish traps, and assessing soil fertility for upcoming plantings. Corn, beans, and squash were carefully sown in freshly turned earth, and herbs were planted near cabins to maintain both sustenance and medicinal needs. Children, older by experience and curiosity, carried small tools, mimicking adults with diligence, yet still laughing at the simple joys of spring. Bradford often walked to the edge of the forest at sunrise, journal in hand, recording not only the progress of crops, but the rhythm of life itself. He noted, renewal is measured not merely in sprouts or sun, but in the hearts and hands of those who endure, learn, and cultivate both land and community. The New World tests continually, yet it rewards care, foresight, and unity. The Wampanoag remained guiding lights. Squanto taught subtle techniques for water conservation in warming soil and pointed out areas where wild game and edible roots thrived. Massasoit reminded the settlers of the necessity of balance. Expansion must be measured, and each action considered, lest carelessness invite hardship. Together, their counsel ensured that Plymouth did not simply survive, but began to flourish quietly, rooted in respect for land and alliance. Even as the colony grew, reflection remained central. Bradford led evening gatherings where settlers shared stories of the past year. The voyage across the Atlantic, the bitter winter, the fires, and the subtle triumphs of enduring hardship. Each tale reinforced both lessons and bonds, highlighting the courage, perseverance, and shared humanity that transformed mere survival into a community of enduring strength. Summer approached, carrying longer days and warmer sun. The settlers' hard work yielded abundance. Corn grew tall, beans twined gracefully, and squash spread generously across the soil. Fish were plentiful in the river, and game moved cautiously but predictably within the forest. The colony's resilience, tested in fire, frost, and uncertainty, had produced more than survival. It had created a foundation for continuity, growth, and hope. Bradford paused often to observe not only crops, but the subtle transformations in the settlers themselves. Children had grown in skill and confidence. Women and men had honed both labor and wisdom. And the bonds of trust and mutual support had solidified into an unspoken covenant of care. He noted in his journal, "Providence has guided us, yet it is through the measured effort of each heart and hand that life is sustained. Our legacy will not rest in structures alone, but in the enduring spirit of those who labor, observe, and unite." The Wampanoag, integral allies throughout, continued to share knowledge of the land's cycles, medicinal plants, and hunting practices. Their guidance, combined with the settlers' perseverance, ensured that Plymouth could look forward with cautious optimism, prepared for the uncertainties, yet confident in their collective strength. As the first communal harvest approached, settlers gathered to celebrate, not merely the crops, but the endurance, courage, and unity that had sustained them. Fires glowed in the clearing, children laughed, and adults shared quiet stories and reflection. Bradford addressed the gathering, voice steady and calm. "We have faced storms, frost, fire, and uncertainty. We have labored, learned, and endured. Let this harvest remind us not only of the bounty before us, but of the courage, patience, and community that have made it possible. May we continue to live with care, wisdom, and unity, for in these our true legacy is found." With the harvest secured, Plymouth stood not merely as a settlement, but as a symbol of human endurance and measured hope. The land, still vast and indifferent, had yielded to diligence, respect, and the careful guidance of alliances. Children ran freely along riverbanks, elders shared stories that shaped memory and tradition, and Bradford continued to observe, record, and reflect. The first year had ended, but its lessons endured. Unity could temper fear, care could transform uncertainty into security, and perseverance could carve life from wilderness. As Bradford looked toward the distant horizon, he understood that Plymouth was more than a colony. It was a living testament to the endurance of courage, the value of wisdom, and the subtle but profound power of human community. In the quiet of evening, with the forest glowing amber in the last rays of the sun, the settlers paused, hearts full, eyes thoughtful, and hands ready. Their story, written in journal and memory, labor and laughter, hardship and triumph, would echo through generations. The new world remained vast, unpredictable, and at times indifferent, yet within Plymouth, life endured, rooted in resilience, nurtured by unity, and guided by the unyielding promise of hope. The journal closed, the fires dimmed, and the first night of summer settled over the clearing. Plymouth slept, but its story of courage, endurance, and shared humanity would continue, whispered in wind through trees, carried in river currents, and remembered in hearts that had dared to endure.